Elizabeth and the Forgotten Promise. One sunny morning, Elizabeth decided to go for a walk to enjoy the flowers and butterflies. Butterflies danced around her and fluttered their wings. Then she spotted her neighbor, Mrs. Maple, standing among the flowers. She waved her hand happily.
Good morning, Mrs. Maple.
Good morning, Elizabeth.
Have you seen my flowers today?
They're putting on their best show for the sunshine. You know, I was wondering if you could help me this afternoon. My hands have been especially achy, and the flowers need watering.
Oh yes, Mrs. Maple, I'll come right after lunch. I promise.
Elizabeth continued down the garden path, thinking about her fun afternoon helping Mrs. Maple. But after lunchtime, Elizabeth's excitement over the garden began to slip out of her mind. She dressed her dolls in fancy gowns and planned a tea party with cookies. Then she dove into her storybook and got swept away in the tale of the brave knight rescuing the princess. Excited by her own entertainment, she went to swing. The hours ran by like a race. She didn't notice how fast the sky turned gold and red with the colors of sunset. And then, Elizabeth remembered her promise. She had forgotten to help Mrs. Maple. She imagined Mrs. Maple standing in her garden, alone and tired, waiting for her. How could she have forgotten such an important promise? She felt very guilty. Then Elizabeth confessed to herself.
I have to apologize to Mrs. Maple.
Early on the next morning, clutching a flower as a symbol of peace, Elizabeth knocked on the Mrs. Maple's door. Mrs. Maple welcomes Elizabeth.
Good morning, Elizabeth. What brings you here so early?
Mrs. Maple, I'm so sorry I didn't come to help with watering yesterday. I got carried away playing with my dolls and reading my book, and I forgot my promise. I feel terrible.
It's all right, dear. But you know, keeping a promise is a special thing. It shows that you're dependable and thoughtful. Keeping your word helps you grow into someone others can count on, and it's one of the best qualities to have.
Elizabeth nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Mrs. Maple's words. She wanted to be someone others could trust.
Mrs. Maple, could I water your flowers today? I'll do extra good work to make up for forgetting yesterday.
Of course you can, dear. Let me grab the watering cans.
Together, they stepped into the colorful garden, surrounded by vivid blooms. Elizabeth carefully watered the flowers and listened to Mrs. Maple's explanations of the different types of flowers. Elizabeth felt happy that she had fulfilled her promise. She would remember the advice. Mrs. Maple's garden became even more lively thanks to Elizabeth's help. Elizabeth got one of her blank notebooks and turned it into her promises book. She grabbed a pencil and wrote her first kept promise.
Help Mrs. Maple with flowers. Complete.
Today, Elizabeth learned a very important lesson that promises must be kept. Elizabeth and the Forgotten Promise. The end.